Chapter 8. Does divorce imply remarriage? It's not an exaggeration to say that the entire debate on divorce and remarriage within the church today centers on one key question. Does obtaining a lawful divorce grant the right to remarry? Those answering yes to this question would suggest that if divorces are permitted by Jesus, then remarriages are also permitted because, in their view, a lawful divorce inherently grants the right to marry again. From this perspective, remarriage is not always an act of adultery. If the marriage that has been broken in a way consistent with biblical teachings, then remarriages are permissible in those cases. To put it another way, they would say that a lawful divorce equals the right to remarry. Their view. The permissive view teachers agree that Jesus never explicitly taught that remarriage was allowed after a divorce. Instead, their arguments for remarriage center around the implications of a divorce in the ancient world. Their argument goes something like this. Jesus allows for divorce in the case of fornication. Therefore, he effectively permits remarriage, since obtaining a legal divorce granted the freedom to remarry in Jewish and pagan cultures of that time. They also assert that if you examine ancient marriage contracts and divorce certificates, you often find that they explicitly state the divorced person has permission to remarry. They conclude that although Jesus explicitly forbade remarriage after divorce and called it adultery without exceptions in Mark chapter 10 verses 11 and 12 and Luke chapter 16 verse 18, we should interpret these passages in light of Matthew chapter 19 verse 9, where he allows for divorce in the case of fornication. If divorce implies permission to remarry, then by permitting divorce in Matthew chapter 19 verse 9, Jesus was technically also allowing remarriage after divorce. Therefore, he could not have meant that all remarriage after divorce is forbidden, even if he appears to say exactly that in Mark and Luke. David Instone Brewer. In order to show how important this idea is, we need only consider David Instone Brewer, who is arguably the leading voice for the permissive view in the world today. The reason he is so frequently cited by permissive view teachers is that he did the necessary research to prove this most important claim, that marriage contracts in the ancient world often presupposed the right to remarry. A. Andrew Das says it this way, quote, Instone Brewer comprehensively documents the divorce certificates from the ancient Near East and Greco-Roman world with their legal expressions of freedom or the permission to remarry. His survey of the universal acceptability of remarriage has clearly been influential. He convinced William Heth to drop his well-known earlier position against remarriage, since apparently everyone in the first century world would have assumed it. End quote. The no-divorce view fell for it. The somewhat new no-divorce view would not need to exist today if they had not fallen for this argument that divorce implies remarriage. The no-divorce view is the view that Jesus did not allow for divorce at all, and that fornication only applies to betrothals, or alternatively that there was a mistranslation of some kind in Matthew chapter 5 verse 32 and chapter 19 verse 9, and that Jesus did not give exceptions for divorce at all. I will systematically refute the no-divorce view in chapter 12, but I should say that even though I disagree with them, I am sympathetic to their cause for the following reason. They correctly teach that all remarriage after divorce is adultery while the spouse is still living. However, instead of teaching, as the early church did, that Jesus allowed for divorce but forbade remarriage, they accepted the argument of the modern permissive view teachers, that divorce implies the right to remarry. Consequently, they felt compelled to argue that divorce itself is not allowed, in order to uphold the truth that remarriage is forbidden. So, both the permissive view and the no-divorce views are built on the faulty foundation that a divorce implies the right to remarry. Their arguments. To support their claim that a divorce implies the freedom to remarry for Christians, they offer two main lines of evidence. One, ancient divorce certificates sometimes mention the right to remarry, and two, ancient cultures tended to assume that a divorce implied the right to remarriage. Let's take a closer look at the first argument. Ancient divorce certificates sometimes mention the right to remarry. Divorce certificates, or writs of divorce, are a very important part of this debate. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, it talks about giving the divorced wife a, quote, certificate of divorce, end quote. And Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19, verse 8, that Moses permitted divorce certificates. So the obvious question is, what was written on the divorce certificate? What was its purpose? The permissive view teachers will say that the divorce certificates were given so that the woman could prove to prospective second husbands that she could be remarried without them being accused of adultery. David Instone Brewer says this bluntly regarding Jewish divorce certificates. Quote, "In fact, the purpose of the divorce certificate was to help the woman remarry." End quote. If that is the case, that divorce certificates were allowed by Moses in order to make it easier for the divorced spouse to remarry, then it would be strong evidence against the traditional view. Certainly, it would disprove my theory in an earlier chapter that the correct interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, is that remarriage after divorce is forbidden. Dowries, the elephant in the room. There is another reason that Moses might have instituted certificates of divorce, and it's also the main reason that divorce certificates were issued in the ancient world as well, for the return of the dowry. A dowry is a transfer of money, property, or valuable goods given by the bride's family to the groom or his family. The dowry was often seen as the daughter's portion of the family estate, entrusted to her husband on her behalf. In this way, the bride's father's contribution helped the couple establish their household. The dowry also provided financial security for the bride, as it remained her property. If her husband died or divorced her, she had funds to support herself. However, if the wife was at fault for the divorce, sometimes she would only receive half the dowry, or in most cases, she would lose all claims to it. You have probably understood as a student of the Bible that to be a woman without the support of a husband in ancient times was not a good situation. And so if a man was going to divorce his wife, he had to at least agree to give back her inheritance. Unwanted evidence. David Instone Brewer undertook his project of translating ancient divorce certificates in order to prove his theory that remarriage was the primary reason that they were issued. While he did find that remarriage was mentioned in many cases, dowries were by far the main concern in those documents. A. Andrew Doss did a survey of the data and found that the primary issue at hand was the dowry being returned, and that remarriage was a secondary issue. Quote, "Divorce documents typically include the date and place of the agreement, the names of the parties involved and their hometowns, a certification that the dowry had been returned, a certification that neither party had grounds to litigate against the other, and finally, the signature of the witnesses. Several other secondary features are present in some cases. For instance, several of the papyri include an affirmation that the parties are legally permitted after the divorce to remarry anyone they wish." End quote. Doss later concludes that only about a third of the documents mentioned remarriage explicitly. So, if the majority of the documents do not mention remarriage but do mention dowry issues, it would not be in line with David Instone Brewer's claim that the purpose of ancient divorce certificates was to help the woman remarry. What does David Instone Brewer say about this? Quote, "The legal permission to remarry was a traditional element of the divorce deed. It was not strictly necessary because divorce by itself gave an individual the legal right to remarry. The permission to remarry was often assumed even when it was not explicitly stated." End quote. He is saying that the documents he researched didn't need to mention the right to remarry because it would have been assumed by everyone. This is a classic case of the circular reasoning fallacy. The reason he couldn't find proof of his theory was because his theory is true. One wonders why he went looking for evidence of this type in the first place if he knew that the majority of the documents would be silent on the issue. The Old Testament. What does the Bible say on the matter? All parties agree that the Bible itself does not tell us what is on the divorce certificate that Moses permitted, so we are left to speculate. David Instone Brewer makes the bold claim that he knows what was on the certificate in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. Quote, "The wording on the divorce certificate is not stated in the Pentateuch, but there are good reasons to conclude that it was similar to the wording of standard rabbinic divorce certificates. You are allowed to marry any man you wish." End quote. In other words, he assumes that the Jews, centuries later in Babylon, had the same wording as the certificates authorized by Moses, which is an explicit permission to remarry. This is a fair assumption, but it is still an assumption. As Instone Brewer himself admits, there is no evidence in the Bible itself for his view. I would argue that the whole interaction with Jesus and the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 19 seems to suggest that the Jews in the first century had fundamentally misunderstood the issue of divorce and remarriage in Deuteronomy 24, which prompts Jesus to shock even his own disciples when he corrects them on this issue. So it stands to reason that the divorce certificates written by the Pharisees centuries later might reflect their own desires to remarry, rather than the original purpose of the certificate. Ketubah. It should also be mentioned that arguably the most important document regarding Jewish marriage in both ancient and modern times is the Ketubah. The main purpose of the Ketubah is to establish the amount of money the man would pay the wife if he divorced her or if he died. It would include the bride price and/or the dowry amount to be returned to the woman in the event of divorce. Wikipedia says of the Ketubah, quote, "The Ketubah served as a contract, whereby the amount due to the wife, the bride price, came to be paid in the event of the cessation of marriage, either by the death of the husband or divorce." End quote. The Talmud calls this divorce payment the fundamental requirement of the Ketubah. Quote, "How much does the marriage contract require him to promise to have paid to her in the event of his death or his divorcing her? If the bride is a virgin, no less than 200 denarim. If she is not a virgin, no less than 100 denarim. This amount is called the fundamental requirement of the Ketubah." End quote. The key point to understand is that in Jewish culture, it was traditionally assumed that a wife would receive financial compensation in the event of a divorce. The Ketubah, which functions like a prenuptial agreement, was developed relatively recently, after the Babylonian exile. It is reasonable to infer that matters concerning dowries and other financial obligations in the Ketubah were initially part of the Jewish divorce certificate. In other words, the primary shift after the exile was that these financial arrangements began to be addressed before the marriage, rather than after. Modern Jewish divorce certificates that mention the right to remarry are possibly later additions, influenced by a misunderstanding of Mosaic law, which Jesus rebukes them for in Matthew chapter 19. The theory that they shifted the details of divorce to prenuptial agreements likely reflects their true intentions. They had begun to treat divorce as an assumed outcome, effectively pre-writing the writs of divorce in advance with the Ketubah. Ancient cultures tended to assume that a divorce implied remarriage. The second major argument that the permissive view teachers make to support the idea that a divorce implies the right to remarry is that such an idea was the predominant view of the ancient Jews and pagans alike. They would say that it was the near universal understanding among ancient people that a divorce implied the right to remarry. I am far less concerned about what the ancient pagans thought about any issue to do with morality, since they held many values that are considered sinful in a biblical worldview. But what the ancient Jews thought about this issue is a much more relevant topic. If all the Jews in the ancient world held that divorce implied the right to remarry, then it would be something to consider. After all, I'm suggesting that the correct interpretation of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, is that divorce is acceptable, but remarriage is not. And if that were true, you would expect at least some ancient Jews to have interpreted it that way as well. The Essenes, the other religious Jews. The Essenes were one of the three main Jewish sects during the Second Temple period, alongside the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They were a small ascetic community that separated themselves from mainstream Jewish society in pursuit of spiritual purity and strict adherence to their interpretation of Jewish law. Their most famous settlement was at Qumran, near the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Some scholars suggest that John the Baptist might have had connections with the Essenes, given his ascetic lifestyle, emphasis on repentance, and baptism rituals, which were similar to the ritual cleansing practices of the Essenes. The Essenes shared several beliefs that later aligned with early Christian doctrine, but diverged from mainstream Jewish thought of the time. 1. Messianic expectation. Like early Christians, the Essenes believed in the coming of a Messiah. This concept of a divine Redeemer was less emphasized in traditional Jewish thought but became central to Christianity. 2. Belief in the afterlife. The Essenes, unlike the Sadducees, believed in the immortality of the soul and an afterlife with rewards for the righteous and punishment for the wicked. This aligns more closely with Christian doctrines of heaven and hell than with certain Jewish sects at the time. 3. Ritual cleansing and baptism. The Essenes practiced ritual cleansing through immersion in water as a symbol of purification from sin, a concept that strongly resonates with the Christian practice of baptism. While Jewish ritual baths, mikveh, existed, the Essenes gave this practice special emphasis, similar to the significance that baptism later held in Christianity. The Essenes on divorce and remarriage. The Essenes taught that while divorce was permitted, remarriage was not while the other spouse lived, essentially the same as the traditional view of the early Christians and the thesis of this book, though this is hotly debated among scholars. The primary source fueling this debate is the Damascus document, also known as the Zadokite fragments, particularly passages found in CD 420 through 5:6. The text refers to those who, quote, take 2 wives in their lifetime, end quote, which seems to forbid remarriage. However, this phrase has also been interpreted as a condemnation of polygamy, having more than one wife simultaneously. Scholars like Jerome Murphy O'Connor have defended the idea that this is speaking of remarriage. In his 1970 study published in the Revue Biblique, Murphy O'Connor argues that the Essenes' prohibition was not against polygamy, but against entering into a second marriage at any point in one's life. Quote, the masculine suffix should be understood at face value, unless there are compelling reasons to interpret it otherwise. In this case, there are no such reasons. The masculine suffix makes perfect sense. However, interpreting it as merely a prohibition of polygamy introduces a restriction that the text itself does not specify. The text does not simply forbid having 2 wives simultaneously. It goes much further, prohibiting 2 marriages within a single lifetime, whether after the death of a spouse or following a divorce, end quote. Additional support for the interpretation that the Essenes prohibited remarriage is found in the Temple Scroll from Qumran, specifically in 11Q Temple Scroll 57, 15 through 19. This text outlines laws for an ideal Israelite king, stating that he, quote, shall not take another wife. She alone shall be with him all the days of her life, end quote. This directive implies a prohibition not only against polygamy, but also against remarriage after the death of a spouse or following a divorce. A. Andrew Das says the following of this in his book. Quote, while divorce was permitted by the Essenes, the Qumran scrolls in multiple places warn against illicit remarriage. The king of 11 QTA 57 having to wait until his spouse dies before remarrying, the equation of second marriages with fornication in CD 4, and the permission to marry only unmarried virgins or chaste widows in 4QDF 3, 10 through 15.151. As Elledge concludes from his review, the Qumran scrolls exhibit a clear and strong trajectory of the utmost concern for the endangerments posed by remarriage, end quote. Why do the Essenes matter? The significance of the Essenes' stance on remarriage lies in its potential to undermine the central argument made by proponents of the permissive view on divorce and remarriage. The permissive view holds that divorce in the ancient world implied the right to remarry because it was the near-universal assumption among both Jewish and pagan cultures. However, the existence of the Essenes, an influential Jewish sect that taught that divorce did not imply the right to remarry, poses a significant challenge to this premise. If even one Jewish group in the Second Temple period believed that remarriage was forbidden after divorce or the death of a spouse, it contradicts the assumption that remarriage was universally permitted following divorce. The Essenes' interpretation of marriage and divorce demonstrates that not all ancient Jewish communities viewed divorce as automatically granting permission for remarriage, thereby invalidating the claim that this understanding was universal. Another problem: Jesus does not agree. As we have seen, the permissive view teachers promote the idea that everyone in pagan and Jewish culture accepted that a divorce meant you had the freedom to remarry. They make a big deal about how the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Jesus' day had no issues with remarriage at all. They need you to believe that the concept of remarriage after a divorce was so universal that when you see divorce allowed for various reasons in Scripture, you can safely assume that remarriage is implied in that passage, even if it doesn't actually say that. That is the only way that their theory works. The problem with that is Jesus' words in the passages where there are no exception clauses, because it's absolutely clear that Jesus does not assume that a divorce implies the freedom to remarry. Quote, "And he said to them, 'Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery.'" End quote. Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. Quote, "Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery." End quote. Luke chapter 16, verse 18. Clearly, Jesus does not think that just because you have been divorced, you can remarry. The very fact that Jesus calls remarriage after divorce adultery should end the matter right there. Even if you think that Jesus' teaching here was the first time anyone in Jewish history came up with the idea that remarriage after divorce was bad, in other words, you don't believe that Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 1 through 4 forbids remarriage, and you don't believe the Essenes forbid remarriage, it should still end the matter, since Jesus, who is the only person that matters, forbids it. Even if you think that he didn't really mean to say everyone and whoever in the above passages, and you think we need to read back the exception clauses into this passage and apply them to remarriage instead of divorce, it should still be enough to refute the idea that all of the ancient world permitted remarriage after a divorce, because there was this one guy named Jesus who said that remarriage after divorce was adultery, at least in some cases, which according to the permissive view, no one ever believed. Another problem: Paul does not agree. We will look at these passages in more detail later, but the Apostle Paul clearly does not share the view that everyone who is divorced is free to remarry. In fact, he seems to state very bluntly in several places that remarriage is forbidden except after the death of a spouse. Quote, "But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife." End quote. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. Quote, "For the married woman is bound by law to her husband while he is living. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law concerning the husband. So then, if while her husband is living she is joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, though she is joined to another man." End quote. Romans chapter 7, verses 2 and 3. If the permissive view is true, and everyone in the Jewish world accepted that remarriages were permitted after divorces without restriction, then where in the world does Paul, a former Pharisee, get his theology that a woman cannot remarry while her divorced husband is still living? Such an idea is supposed to be unheard of in the Jewish world according to David Instone Brewer, and yet Paul talks about it like it is fundamental doctrine. Conclusion: this chapter has critically examined the foundation of the permissive view on divorce and remarriage, which asserts that divorce inherently grants the right to remarry. We have found this premise to be flawed on several grounds. 1. The primary purpose of ancient divorce certificates was often to address dowry issues, not to grant permission to remarry. 2. The assumption that all ancient cultures, including Jewish society, universally accepted remarriage after divorce is contradicted by evidence from groups like the Essenes. 3. Jesus' teachings in Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, and Luke chapter 16, verse 18, clearly do not assume that divorce implies the right to remarry, as he explicitly calls remarriages adultery. And 4. Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 10 and 11, and Romans chapter 7, verses 2 and 3, further reinforce the view that remarriage after divorce is not permitted while the former spouse lives. These findings significantly undermine the permissive view's core argument and suggest that a more nuanced understanding of divorce and remarriage in the biblical context is necessary. The traditional view, which allows for divorce in certain circumstances but prohibits remarriage while the former spouse lives, appears to align more closely with the teachings of Jesus and Paul, as well as with some Jewish interpretations of the time.